"We're out of ammo. Don't try to save us, just tell our families we fought." The radio crackled with static from deep within the Gila Mountains, where Bravo team was trapped. No way out, no hope, and even the bravest SEALs had begun to brace themselves for death. At Holloman Base, no one dared to argue. The drones couldn't get through and the pilots only shook their heads. But in the far corner of the room, a female pilot rose to her feet in silence. She didn't wait for orders. She only tightened her gloves and walked toward her. A-10. Because if no one else would go into the fire, she would. Her name was Major Sarah Callahan. Her story did not begin with the dazzling glow of a spotlight, nor with a prestigious medal pinned proudly to her chest. It began in a small town in Texas, where the red earth baked under the sun and the dusty winds rose like a reminder that here, everything born into this land had to learn endurance. Sarah grew up in a modest wooden house in Amarillo, without a father who was a 4-star general, nor a mother who was a powerful senator. Her family left her nothing but a simple belief: do the right thing, even when no one is watching. In the military, that belief did not always make her life easier. At Holloman Base, where Sarah was stationed, the name Callahan did not immediately summon respect the way certain distinguished lineages echoed through Air Force history. Instead, it often came with a nickname, half mocking, half serious: Storm Witch, the Witch of the Skies. The name came from one peculiar habit. Sarah was silent to the point of discomfort. At pilot parties where laughter and music thundered across the bar, she would sit quietly in a corner, rolling a beer can in her hand, without ever finishing it. When her squad mates argued loudly over the optimal flight path, she simply listened, occasionally nodding. One young officer once muttered, "It's like she's listening to voices from the clouds." And so Stormwitch was born, part jest, part camouflage for something they couldn't quite explain. The strange thing was, she never reacted. No anger, no attempt to correct them. Sometimes, when asked directly, "Do you hate that nickname?" Sarah would just shrug. That indifference confused people even more. Because in an environment where everyone strained to prove they were the coolest, the toughest, the boldest, having a pilot who did not even bother to argue felt like watching an out-of-place stranger on stage. Some senior officers saw her silence as a problem. They wrote notes into her record: distant, difficult to command, unsuited for military politics. Perhaps they weren't wrong. Sarah never volunteered for press briefings to boast of successful missions, nor did she flatter superiors to earn more medals. Instead, she returned to the gym, or stood by the runway, watching aircraft descend in the fading glow of sunset. And yet, on the battlefield, infantrymen who had seen the shadow of her A-10 sweep across the sky understood better. They did not call her Storm Witch. They called her simply the last person you'd ever want to leave behind. Because when Sarah appeared, the thunder of the GAU-8 Avenger meant a chance to live. And for men pinned beneath enemy fire, that was worth more than any speech. Once, a Marine sergeant recalled, when I was pinned down under the hail of bullets in Helmand, I heard her engines. It was like the sound of a fireplace in winter. You just knew you'd survive the night. Such words never made it into official reports, but they passed quietly, trench to trench, like a secret code of gratitude. Still, in the eyes of analysts seated in the Pentagon, Sarah remained just another A-10 pilot, nothing more. A cog in the vast machine. A female officer with no powerful family, no silver tongue, and too odd to be placed in any prestigious role. When promotion lists were drawn up, Callahan's name often sat at the bottom. Ironically, that very neglect granted Sarah more freedom than most of her peers. Unbound by expectations, spared from playing the perfect hero in the public eye, she held only one purpose: to fly and to survive. Perhaps, in her heart, survival mattered more than glory ever could. Of course, that freedom made her a thorn in the side of some commanders. One captain grumbled, "She never fits the mold." And the military hates nothing more than someone who doesn't fit. Yet Sarah cared little. She knew that in places where enemy fire could wipe out a platoon in minutes, no one cared whether you fit the mold or not. They could laugh at her nickname back at base, call her strange, call her Storm Witch, but on the battlefield, no one dared to joke when her iron hog roared overhead. In those moments, Sarah became something they would never again underestimate. A storm that chose where to strike. The irony was, even as soldiers on the ground whispered thanks, the official report still stamped her role with cold indifference. Attend support, non-essential. Perhaps they thought it was all luck. But one day, the very woman they dismissed would make the entire world look up at the sky differently. Because sometimes, it is the ones least expected who create the impossible. Not everyone knew that the nickname Storm Witch did not come from cold silence or an unreadable gaze, but from a winter night in 2010, high in the mountains of Montana. While much of the country lay buried in white snow, the training squadron Sarah was part of found itself swallowed by fog and winds slamming hard against the ridges. The young, inexperienced aircraft shuddered in the turbulence, and one by one they turned back toward base, leaving behind a stretch of sky blocked by storm. Only one aircraft did not turn back. Sarah at the time was just a young pilot, too junior to impress anyone. But instead of obediently retreating, she dove straight into the dense clouds. From the control tower, they said the radar nearly lost her for several long minutes. Everyone thought, she's gone. Then, suddenly, a calm voice came through. Runways clear. Winds from the north. Follow me. She flew not by instruments but by instinct. She sought out the rare cracks of light in the sky, felt every shift in pressure, listened to the silences between the roar of engines. And somehow she guided the entire squadron through the blizzard, one by one landing safely. From that day, the name Storm Witch was born. To some, she was a witch for daring to challenge the storm. To others, she was a prodigy who could read the language of the sky in a way no one else could. But to Sarah, that past was not glory. It was a burden. Because every time she looked in the mirror, she did not see a hero. She only saw a face lucky to be alive while so many others had not returned. The question haunted her again and again. Why am I still here when they are not? The world's view was different. To the officers, she was reckless, a liability. They feared that one day Sarah would dive where no one could save her, and drag disaster behind. But the truth was simpler. She did not seek danger. She lived by a single principle. If someone called for help, she could not pretend not to hear. That principle might sound romantic, but in real combat it made her stand out in ways both frustrating and unforgettable. There was one mission in Afghanistan when an American infantry unit was pinned down under merciless fire. Command ordered, maintain safe distance, await additional support. Every other pilot obeyed except Sarah. She dropped so low that the soldiers on the ground could see every detail on her aircraft, and in those few short minutes, they broke free of the encirclement. Back at base, the report read, "Reckless maneuver, non-compliant with protocol." But in a makeshift bar in Kabul, the rescued soldiers taped a scrap of paper to the wall with 4 scrawled words, "Which saved us." That contrast followed her everywhere. In the official files, she was the insubordinate. In the memories of men who had lived because of her, she was the one who never turned her back. And in that contradiction lay Sarah's true character, not pride, not recklessness, but an unyielding loyalty to human life. Ironically, that very nature left her out of place at medal-pinned banquets. While others drank deep and boasted of victories, Sarah often sat apart, tapping her spoon against a coffee cup. Once, a squadmate joked she looked more like a tired high school teacher than a combat pilot. Sarah only laughed, admitting that maybe it was true. She had never sought the spotlight because for her, the sky was the only stage worth facing. But the sky was not always a friend. Each time the wind lashed against her aircraft's frame, Sarah remembered the eyes of those who would never see another dawn. That memory etched itself deeper and deeper, transforming into a strange drive. She did not fly to be praised. She flew to make sure at least someone would come home. The blizzard in Montana, the low dive in Afghanistan, and dozens of other moments when she advanced where others stopped together, they formed a mosaic. And when pieced together, one did not see a strange witch. One saw a human being carrying the relentless obsession that life must never be abandoned. And it was that very obsession that would one day stop Sarah from sitting still at Holloman Base when Bravo Team's desperate signal crackled through the air. While others hesitated, weighing what was feasible or not, she already knew. There would be no waiting, not when someone was still calling for help. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. The crackling hiss of the radio cut through the thunder of artillery and the choking haze of smoke. A hoarse voice, almost strangled by the chaos around it, broke through. Bravo Team. Coordinates 34.27. Maw. Repeat. Devil's Maw. Then silence. Only the sound of static remained, sparking again and again like a mournful requiem. Inside the command room, silence fell. Faces hardened by years of war suddenly looked hollow, no one willing to speak. Because everyone knew, once Devil's Maw was named the Canyons of the Damned, it was no different than signing a death notice. Devil's Maw was not just a narrow gorge of swirling winds in Afghanistan. It was the graveyard of countless aircraft that had dared to enter. Too tight for radar to function, winds shifting in an instant, the ground riddled with ambush points. A perfect natural trap, weaponized by the enemy. Sending a Black Hawk helicopter in by daylight would be nothing short of throwing rescue teams into a furnace. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow, commander of the base, shattered the silence with a grim order. Wait until nightfall. Then the Black Hawks can move in. Everyone understood what that meant. By the time the dark arrived, Bravo Team would be nothing more than shredded packs, not living men. The room grew heavier, each passing minute cut like a slow blade against their will. Until one familiar figure rose to her feet, pulling her glove tight over her fingers, the soft click of the clasp ringing like an alarm bell. Sarah Callahan stepped forward to the map spread across the table. Her gray-blue eyes fixed on the coordinates of Devil's Maw, and her voice rang out sharp and final. Number, I'll fly now. A bitter laugh burst out, tinged with despair. A young officer scoffed, half mocking, half pleading. Even drones can't get through. You think flying an A-10 there won't be suicide? The air thickened, all eyes on her. Sarah didn't argue, didn't explain. Just one sentence, cutting like steel. I've flown through the Maw. I know how to ride the winds inside. I don't think I can. I know I can. It was not arrogance. It was the voice of someone who had already accepted that survival was a thread too thin to decorate with bravado. The room went deathly quiet. No one laughed again. The only sound was her boots striking the concrete floor, echoing like the final ticks of a clock counting down to a wager of life and death. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow clenched his fists, but said nothing more. Perhaps in that moment, he understood ordering Callahan to stand down was harder than stopping a storm already breaking loose. Outside, the wind swept sand across the runway in blinding swirls. Sarah walked toward the waiting. A-10, her calmness almost surreal. A young mechanic who had known only the routine of checking tire pressure and wiping cockpits watched her pass, barely daring to breathe. They whispered among themselves that she looked as though she were strolling to a cafe, not about to fly into the canyon that had already swallowed planes whole. She climbed the ladder, sealing the cockpit shut. The metallic clamp echoed through the chests of those standing nearby. The A-10 Warthog was never a graceful bird of steel. Squat, ugly, With stubby wings, it looked like some battered old beast. But that very grotesque frame had shielded countless soldiers on the ground, bringing them home. And now, it would be the iron steed carrying Callahan into the devil's jaws. The engines roared, blasting sand into violent clouds. Infantrymen, some of whom she had shielded before in the chaos of battle, stood still, watching. They knew no one could stop her, just as no one dared to join her. One of them tapped the fuselage softly, as though offering a prayer. As the A-10 rolled forward, some whispered, "She's insane." But in their voices, reverence bled through. Insane, maybe. But that very madness had once brought them home, when every chance had already vanished. The Warthog gathered speed, leaping into the sky. Behind, the runway shrank into a fading line of light. Ahead, only the swirling wall of storm clouds and the black silhouette of mountains gaping like a beast's maw, waiting to devour her. Sarah gripped the stick, steady, unshaken. Perhaps the only thing she still felt was her heartbeat, each thud in perfect rhythm with the roar of the engines. In the command room, no one looked away from the radar. The blips flickered, vanished, reappeared, trembling like wandering souls. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow said nothing, arms folded, eyes locked on the map. He knew. Every chart, every tactic, every risk calculation, they were meaningless now. All that remained was one woman, one principle, and one deadly canyon. The A-10, nicknamed the Iron Hog, roared down the sand-choked runway, shuddering violently as if protesting this reckless mission. The ground crew scrambled in chaos, shoving in belts of armor-piercing rounds, checking hydraulics in minutes instead of hours. One young soldier, reckless and desperate, stitched a patch onto the fuselage, a storm cloud embroidered on it, the old emblem of the squadron that once called Callahan Storm Witch. As if even the machine itself needed a lucky charm before plunging into the devil's maw. When the wheels left the ground, the entire base held its breath. A technician whispered to himself, voice trembling like a prayer. She's flying into a place no one has ever returned from. On the radar, the bright dot surged straight into the void, a journey with only two outcomes, to become legend or to vanish forever. Inside the cramped cockpit, Sarah Callahan sat tall. The canopy was smeared with smoke and sand-laden winds, sensors nearly useless. She pulled the stick, dropping to barely 100 feet, letting the Iron Hog skim along the canyon walls like a blade flirting with its own destruction. Hot winds slammed into the fuselage, each vortex like an invisible fist, trying to snap the wings. Outside, cliffs towered, jagged and merciless, forming walls of stone like the teeth of a beast, ready to swallow whole the fool who dared intrude. Every jolt sent needles spinning across the gauges, warning lights flashing red without pause. Yet Sarah's eyes never left the narrow slit ahead. For her, everything had narrowed to one rhythm, her heartbeat pounding in unison with the roar of the engines. Another pilot might have drowned in terror. She instead felt a strange, calm acceptance that there was never going to be a way back from this flight. Then light flared from the canyon ridge. RPG barrels glinted like serpent eyes in the dark. Sarah reacted in an instant. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger, the Iron Hog's massive 7-barreled cannon, roared to life. The sound was not gunfire. It was thunder detonating inside the valley itself. 30-millimeter shells poured out in torrents, ripping earth apart, shredding bunkers into rubble within seconds. Smoke, fire, and explosions smothered every other sound. The enemy had no chance to recover. The RPG nests that had flared alive were obliterated in a blink. This was no battle, it was a sudden storm of steel crashing down into the canyon. Below, inside their makeshift dugout, Bravo team soldiers who had already resigned themselves to death screamed hoarse with joy. "We see it! My God, we see it!" Eyes that had been hollow with despair now blazed, staring up at the sky, where light burst from the stubby wings of the Iron Hog, a vision they had never believed would come. In that moment, Sarah didn't need to hear them. She knew what they were shouting. On the radio waves, broken signals mixed with wind and gunfire, an orchestra of chaos but alive. She glanced at the console. Fuel still remained, but not much. Another warning blared. Hydraulic system 2, damaged. She laughed softly, a fleeting smile no one else could see. The Iron Hog still flew, stubborn and limping like some battered old beast that refused to die. If it had a soul, surely it was cursing along with her for being dragged into this madness. She dropped lower, engines screaming just above the ground. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands stayed steady on the stick. Every roll, every surge was a dance on the edge of a blade. The swirling winds tried to hurl her into the cliffs, but within the chaos, Callahan found an invisible trail, a path no radar could ever reveal, only the instinct of someone who had once survived inside the storm. The enemy fired again, bursts of tracers streaking upward only to be crushed beneath another avalanche of thunder from the GAU-8. The canyon, once the graveyard of aircraft, now trembled under the wrath of the steel beast striking back. In minutes, the tide had turned. Bravo team was no longer prey, but survivors waiting for a path to open. And Callahan, she was no guardian angel. She was the storm itself, unleashed upon the maw, clearing it with fire and steel. But victory never comes free. Another red light blinked on the panel. The left wing had taken a hit, smoke curling in the mirrors. The aircraft shook harder, metal groaning with each pull of the stick. Sarah tilted her head, whispered to the Iron Hog, "Just a few more minutes, old man." No one else heard. But perhaps the aircraft did. It kept flying, stubbornly clinging to the sky, as though it, too, refused to abandon the soldiers crying for rescue below. Back at the base, eyes stayed glued to the radar, every second stretching into eternity. Some prayed, others clenched fists so tight their nails dug into flesh. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow spoke not a word. He only stared at the screen, where the lone flickering dot kept moving through the canyon, defying probability, defying logic, defying every limit. The smoke and dust hadn't even cleared before the shockwave struck, ripping sand and rock off the canyon walls. But Callahan had no time to watch. From the east came the roar of engines. 2 trucks, machine guns mounted, barreled down the dirt trail like predators closing their trap. Her eyes swept fast, hands tightening around the stick. The Iron Hog tilted its wings, rolled slowly, then dove. The 30mm cannons thundered. The first truck exploded, black smoke curling upward like a pillar of fire. The second swerved in panic, but fate gave it no mercy. Its wheels slipped off the edge and the whole steel beast slammed into the cliffside, bursting apart in a dry, bone-cracking roar. For a moment, the path to Bravo team was clear, but that was only the beginning. A streak of light tore across the sky. An RPG. The rocket hissed up from a hidden ridge, cutting straight toward a Black Hawk helicopter just entering range. Sarah's glance flicked toward it, and she knew there were no flares left. Only one option remained. She herself had to be the decoy. The dive came almost as instinct. The Iron Hog rolled, intercepting the rocket's path. The RPG hit the turbulent wash of her wing, lost guidance, then detonated mid-air. The Black Hawk escaped. The A-10 shuddered violently. In the base, officers held their breath. A young lieutenant gasped, eyes wide with disbelief. She just blocked an RPG with her A-10. It sounded like some bitter joke, but it was cold. Exact truth. The aircraft now hung in tatters like a shredded rag. Hydraulic fluid leaked across its body, the dashboard a sea of red warning lights. But Callahan did not stop. She knew stopping meant Bravo team would never leave the maw alive. She plunged lower, almost scraping stone. New bursts of cannon fire poured out, each strike a downpour of steel. The cliffs shook, Taliban gun nests torn apart before they could fire another shot. The GAU-8's thunder rolled through the gorge like Odin himself had unleashed his wrath. Below, the SEALs burst from their bunker, sprinting toward the landing zone. Before their eyes, the Iron Hog fought through smoke and fire. No longer just a lone pilot, it was a storm, given human form, tearing through everything in its way. On the radio, someone's voice cracked, trembling with awe. "That's not a plane anymore, that's a storm with wings." Bravo team pressed along the rock face, the Black Hawk descending fast in a cloud of dust. Callahan dropped altitude, banking to shred the last enemy nests. Every burst of cannon fire was a shield, forcing the enemy to cower underground instead of raising their weapons. Not a single SEAL fell, not while the Iron Hog roared. But no victory comes without cost. The firelight blinked on. Black smoke trailed from the left engine, a wound that could not be hidden. The aircraft shook harder, like a dying beast forcing itself forward. Sarah could feel every vibration, like a faltering heartbeat, yet she smiled, a defiant grin. "Just a little longer, old man. We're not done yet." That laugh, if anyone had heard it, they would have sworn she'd gone mad. But sometimes, madness is the only thing that keeps a soul from breaking. The last SEALs climbed aboard the Black Hawk. Its engines roared, lifting the helicopter off blood-stained ground. Callahan pulled the Iron Hog up, circling above, placing herself between the Taliban guns and the retreating bird. Every barrel on the ground opened fire in desperation, everyone silenced by the GAU-8's blazing answer. Then a stray round struck her right wing. The plane jolted, controls resisting her grip. She strained with every ounce of strength to hold it steady. The Black Hawk cleared the canyon, bursting out into open skies. Bravo team was safe. But Sarah remained, hanging above the narrow gorge, her aircraft torn to rags. Through smoke, fire, and the fading echoes of battle, the Iron Hog still flew. It roared, not an engine's growl, but the last cry of a beast refusing to die quietly. At the base, Harrow's eyes never left the radar screen. An officer whispered, "Bravo team's out of the maw, but what about her?" No one answered. Only the tiny, flickering dot remained, wavering on the screen like a candle struggling against the storm. Only a few hours after Bravo team was flown back to base, the world already knew their story. Not through the dry reports of the military, but through a shaky video, recorded on a SEAL's helmet cam. The images were blurred by dust, yet still breathtakingly clear. An A-10 skimming the ground, nearly scraping the canyon wall. Then the GAU-8 roared, spitting fire and steel into the darkness. In that single moment, every line between life and death was shattered, and the viewers felt it. Someone had chosen to stand on that line, to shield their brothers. On Twitter, a still frame from the video spread like wildfire. Beneath the image of the Iron Hog diving, smoke and flame trailing behind, were just 6 words. "This angel flies below radar." An angel flying beneath the radar. From Washington to Los Angeles, the news exploded like dry grass set aflame by the wind. Military forums gave a name to her dive, Stormline. Just hearing it conjured the image of an unstoppable tempest. At first, the Pentagon was cold. A spokesman said briefly that Callahan's action was a violation of safety protocols, creating unnecessary risk. But the press conference hadn't even ended when the backlash began. Active duty soldiers, veterans of countless wars, and families who had never set foot in uniform, all spoke with one voice. To them, this wasn't a matter of procedure. It was a matter of courage. A reporter interviewed a member of Bravo team who had just returned. Dust still clung to the SEAL's face. His voice was hoarse, but his eyes burned bright. He spoke slowly, as if afraid to lose the weight of each word. "She didn't just save our lives. She taught us that there are still people who will walk into the fire, even when everything says it's impossible." That sentence replayed over and over on television, spliced with the image of the Iron Hog plunging like lightning. Within hours, from a small hashtag, Number Storm Witch climbed to the top of trending. Memes spread, poems were written, and sketches painted her as a modern-day Valkyrie. Ironically, in the midst of the media storm, Callahan herself knew nothing. She lay in the infirmary, body wrapped in bandages, hair matted with smoke and fuel, staring only at the sterile white of the hospital ceiling. When a nurse flicked on the television, the news was replaying the A-10 spitting fire in the gorge. Sarah raised an eyebrow, half a laugh, half a sigh. Well, with camera shake like that, Hollywood's not hiring. A dry humor, but the only way she could hide her exhaustion. In the base, young officers whispered. Some called her reckless, others called her a hero. But Harrow, the old general, remained silent. He knew better than anyone. History is not born from procedures. It is born from those who dare to break them. Beyond the base, late-night talk shows opened with the story. The host grinned. When you think guardian angel, you imagine a soft white glow. But the U.S. military gives you an A-10 with a 30mm cannon. The audience laughed but then fell quiet, because everyone knew behind the joke lay blood, smoke, and moments that bordered on the miraculous. Emails flooded the base from across the country. Some just a few lines. Thank you for giving us faith that someone out there is still willing to shield my son. Words simple, but heavier than any medal or combat report. In the hospital, Sarah quietly read a few printed letters. Among the scrawled handwriting of an 8-year-old was a line that made her smile faintly. You dived so fast, I thought the plane was going to crash straight into Earth. Innocence, yes, but also a reminder that the world was watching, and that sometimes one act of madness could become a spark of inspiration. The media refused to let go. Some journalists called her the Storm Witch, the witch who rides the storm. One magazine put the Iron Hog on its cover with the headline, When Angels Carry Cannons. Analysts argued over tactics, legality, protocols. But the American public saw only one thing. A woman who chose to stand in the fire so her comrades could live. And that, to them, transcended every regulation. Whether she wanted it or not, Sarah Callahan had become a symbol. Not a symbol crafted by the Pentagon, but one born of blood, fire, and a courage no document could ever define. 3 weeks after the media storm, Callahan sat inside a closed-door meeting room at the base. The harsh fluorescent lights bore down on the cold faces of the generals, and for a few long seconds the air grew heavy, as though someone had sealed off every exit. The official decision was delivered. She was suspended, but the ban would not last. Instead of casting her out, they chose another path. Callahan was summoned to serve as an instructor for low-altitude tactical flight. The order came with one condition: no simulations, real flights, real terrain. It was both punishment and reward. A subtle way for the military to keep her within discipline, but also an unspoken admission. No one but Sarah could pass on the experience that had made her the Storm Witch. For the young pilots, those training sessions were like a mythical adventure. No endless PowerPoint slides, no crowded charts. Only the roar of engines, the rush of wind against the canopy, and the sight of Callahan leading them at altitudes that made most stomachs lurch. She taught them to read the landscape as if it were an open book, to hear the wind and know which turn was safe and which was suicide. Most of all, she taught them this. Sometimes, the choice between life and death is not written in the flight manual, but in the heart of the one at the stick. The younger pilots began to whisper a name for her training, the Storm Method. Of course, no official manual recognized it, yet everyone spoke those 2 words with eyes filled with both awe and fear. To them, the Storm Method was not just a flying technique. It was a spirit, to fly where no one else dared, to carve a path for those who followed. Years passed, and the Storm Method continued to flow from one class to the next. In a training course out in Nevada, where the vast desert stretched like a dry ocean, a young cadet timidly raised his hand. Outside, the wind whipped up red dust against the glass. He asked the question every generation of pilots had carried. "Major, why did you dare to fly that low that day?" Callahan was silent for a long time. Her gaze drifted out the window, to where the horizon was being swallowed by the hot wind. In that moment, the training room grew utterly still, no scratching of pens, no nervous breathing, only her, and the memory of that burning Afghan canyon. Her answer finally came, soft enough that one had to strain to hear. "Because they said it couldn't be done. But I knew better. Sometimes, when no one else will walk into the fire, you have to become the storm." Her words rippled through the room like an echo from the past. They were not a lecture, nor a rule to memorize. They were like a key, unlocking a door inside each student's heart. Some gave a half smile to hide their emotions, others nodded quietly, and most simply sat frozen, letting those words carve themselves into memory. The storm cloud patch, hand-stitched years ago, Sarah still kept. It lay atop her old flight suit, its shoulders frayed, its colors faded by sun and wind. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a rough scrap of cloth. But to her, and to the generations of young pilots, it was a symbol. A reminder that even when the world insists something is impossible, someone will dare to cross the line. Sometimes, in rare moments of solitude, Sarah would replay the old video. The image was shaky, the sound distorted, yet every time she watched, she let out a quiet laugh. The quality's so bad it'd never make a movie trailer, she thought, then shook her head. Perhaps that was for the best. Because the real film had already unfolded in the skies that day, and no lens could ever capture it all. And Bravo team? Years later, whenever they recalled that fateful day, they still had no name for her but Storm Witch. Some of them left the service, became fathers, became husbands, but in their rare reunions, they still raised a glass, called her name, as though thanks would never be enough. In time, the press stopped drilling into breaches of procedure. Instead, they spoke of Callahan as proof that sometimes the U.S. military was not only machines and discipline, but also hearts willing to burn for their brothers. In Nevada, the sun poured over the desert, its golden light making the red dust glow. Callahan stood outside the hangar, watching her young cadets charge toward the runway. In that moment, she understood clearly. The storm method was no longer hers alone. It had become a current, flowing forward, carried on even after she herself left the cockpit. And somewhere, high above the sky, perhaps the sound still lingered, the thunder of an A-10 mingling with the furious beat of human hearts. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.
Get out of this area, you don't belong here. Those words did not come from a drunken bigot, but from a police officer pointing his finger at a man who was merely sitting and reading a newspaper. No weapons, no shouting, no resistance. Yet because of his skin color, his age, and his silence, he was perceived as a threat. What happened next stunned the entire nation. For that man was not just a veteran. He had served as a Navy SEAL, saving 9 lives in Afghanistan, and now he was being dragged away from the very country he once defended. In Fort Collins, there are neighborhoods that seem lifted straight from an advertisement. Red brick sidewalks, a croissant bakery with a handwritten chalkboard sign, and houses behind immaculate white picket fences. Everything here is clean, bright, and appears to leave no room for mess. Jerome J.T. Thacker wasn't messy, but he didn't exactly fit that picture either. At 62, with dark skin and shoulders as broad as a wooden beam, he looked like driftwood washed up in a leather furniture showroom. Whenever he strolled down College Avenue, hands tucked in the pockets of his worn coat, gaze fixed straight ahead, people would stop not to greet him, but to stare. He caused no trouble, never did. JT didn't smoke, didn't shout, didn't beg. He simply appeared like a shadow at high noon in Colorado's silent, receding, arriving from nowhere and headed for who knows where. He lived in a dilapidated ground floor room near Riverside, where winter winds whistled through the cracks and summer sun beat down through the tin roof. The small room, its paint peeling, held only a battered armchair and an AM radio perpetually playing half-heard country music. No visitors came, no friends, no family, no one to talk with. Even the paper carrier left his newspaper at a distance, as if JT might conduct electricity, but he never complained. Perhaps he'd grown used to the world forgetting him, or perhaps he'd once lived somewhere you survived only by staying silent and disappearing. Locals called him the strange old man. Children warned one another to keep their distance. He's homeless or he's got issues. Police didn't use his name. They had an internal code, Ghost Charlie, a half-joking, half-wary label, a potential unidentified target, a ghost with no intel, because for some unspoken reason, he made them uneasy. Maybe because he felt no fear, maybe because he needed no one, or simply because he didn't belong here. He once tried the downtown cafe. Only once. He ordered an iced black coffee, sat in the far corner, and said nothing. The barista came over after a few minutes, apologized, and said the machine had broken. JT never returned, not because the coffee tasted bad, but because of the glances from those who had sat near him, looks that said his presence was something wrong. People usually like old storytellers, or at least those who can offer a gentle smile. JT told no stories. He didn't smile. He passed by like the January wind, making no sound, yet giving people chills. He neither confirmed nor denied who he once was. He carried no veteran's ID, flaunted no youthful photographs. All traces of his past lay in the way he walked, straight, slow but steady, as if each step was a test he knew all too well. Some said he'd been a sailor. Others said he'd served time in prison. No one knew for sure, but everyone had a reason never to ask. And as people often do with what they don't understand, they labeled him. To them, JT was strange, under surveillance, keep away. Yet no one wondered, if he truly was Ghost Charlie, then where had he come from? And if he was a ghost, what had killed him?
Welcome to Veteran Hero Medal, where silent scars speak, honor lives on, and real heroes wear no capes.
There are things that need no introduction, only presence. With JT, it was his right hand. Whenever he rolled back the sleeve of his coat, a flash of worn silver gleamed, neither brilliant nor polished like a wedding ring, but muted and battle-hardened. A silver ring, its surface scuffed as if it had struck stone, sand, and molten metal. At its center was an anchor entwined by a serpent, encircled by the emblem of SEAL Team 4, the Special Operations Unit once deployed on missions most Americans only heard of in vague defense bulletins. It wasn't jewelry. It was the only thing he wore. Most of the time, people didn't notice. But one day at the post office, a retired Marine standing behind him in line did. The Marine paused, nodded respectfully, and said nothing. JT did not respond. They didn't need to. For those who survived nameless missions together, one look was enough. On his boots caked with mud and winter slush was a small inscription on the heel, "Hope Enduring Freedom." Any veteran would recognize it immediately. Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, scorching sands and nights unmarked by the names of the fallen. JT never spoke of the war, but those traces never left him. They simply didn't require display. On the rare occasion he sat in the bakery, a young student accidentally dropped her phone at his feet. As she bent to retrieve it, she paused for a second. Her gaze flicked over his snow-dusted boots and scuffed silver ring, then quietly moved to his weathered face. She offered an awkward smile, whispered thanks, and left, but from that day on, she placed an extra pastry beside the coffee he ordered. No note, no label, just a pastry. And he never touched it. Some might ask, why doesn't he say it was a seal? But that's a question only those who've never served would ask. A person entrusted with comrades' lives, who sat in a helicopter on a pitch-black night, knows that titles save no one, and sometimes silence is the only way to keep something intact within the soul. To JT, the ring was a wordless reminder, and those boots, though old, bore the footsteps of someone who'd overcome what the world called an impossible mission. Only one thing felt off to people. He never attended memorial events. No flags, no cemeteries, no veteran gatherings. When others convened to share old stories, he chose to walk a little further away, steering clear of streets draped in red and white banners. It seemed his homecoming was not to America, but to some realm of memory that only he remembered clearly. No one ever saw him cry. But once, on Thanksgiving, the bakery owner placed a small flag on the counter. When he walked in and saw it, he stopped and didn't step inside. His eyes seemed to search memories, then he quietly backed away to the door, no words, no sound. Sometimes the past needs no telling. It's etched on a person like gunpowder dust clinging to cloth. And JT, with his silver ring and worn boots, carried a time no one else could see, but those perceptive enough could feel. But if the past can't remain hidden forever, what happens when someone tries to tear that curtain away by force? Stay tuned. That morning, the air was colder than usual. Last night's snowfall hadn't fully melted, but the sunlight glistening on the wet pavement lent a sense of clarity. JT sat on his familiar bench in front of the bakery, as he did every Saturday morning. He held the local newspaper folded in half, his eyes scanning the small headlines, partly to read, partly to keep his hands and mind occupied. He liked that spot, not too close to the bakery door to be obtrusive, yet not so far that he'd disappear into the street, just close enough to hear the door's tinkling bell with each customer's entry, and the sweet aroma of fresh pastries drifting out the crack. He didn't need anything more. But the world seemed to think otherwise. A Fort Collins patrol car pulled up just a few steps from the bench. A young officer stepped out, tall and lean, crew-cut hair, sunglasses reflecting the snowy ground. He didn't hurry, but each stride carried intent, and the atmosphere suddenly sagged, as though a cloud had formed in an otherwise clear sky. Joshua Mendenhall, 34, had a reputation for cracking down on anything that doesn't fit the safe profile. He saw JT, an older black man, sitting alone for no obvious reason. To him, that was cause for inquiry. "What are you doing here?" His question held no greeting. He slowly lifted his head and gently folded his newspaper. There was no challenge in his eyes, but no fear either. "I'm just reading the paper." No raised voices, no aggression. Yet as Mendenhall's hand tightened around his duty belt, passers-by began to notice. "Do you have identification? Driver's license? ID?" ID did not answer immediately. He laid the paper on his lap, as if weighing what was truly happening. It was a brief moment, but long enough to make the officer squint. "I need to check. You're making me uncomfortable." No one spoke aloud, but several inside the bakery pulled out their phones. Maybe instinct, Maybe because they'd seen too many online videos with unhappy endings. Mendenhall approached, his right hand hovering over his flashlight, his left hand reaching to tap JT's shoulder, signaling him to stand. But JT did not move. Not out of stubbornness, but as if he'd grown accustomed to being misunderstood. He remained seated, gaze unwavering on the officer, not defiant, simply unyielding. Then the inevitable happened. Mendenhall placed both hands on JT's shoulders, pressing down as if to subdue him. The bench scraped against the snow, and like an invisible signal, at least 7 phones were raised. No shouts, no one intervened, but their eyes were glued to every movement. The crowd's silence then weighed heavier than any siren. A young woman pushing the bakery door froze mid-step. A father laid a hand on his son's shoulder, pulling him back inside. Across the street, a retired firefighter set his coffee down, staring at the detained man as though he just recognized something he could hardly believe. Because those boots, that ring, and the way he showed no fear, could not belong to an ordinary man. Can you guess what happens next? Relax, leave a 1, or comment, "I'm still here," to keep listening. That silence, the moment when the entire space froze between 2 breaths, lasted only a few seconds. But for JT, it felt longer than a nighttime withdrawal under fire. Longer than the whir of a helicopter that never came. Longer than the span between life and death in a sand-choked alley in eastern Afghanistan. Joshua Mendenhall, still too young to understand that silence has a voice, pressed his hand into JT's chest. Not forcefully, but enough to trigger something in the crowd. And it surfaced not in shouts, but as a hoarse whisper from a shadowed corner behind the coffee cart. "He kicked down the door to save me from that Taliban hideout." The words were quiet, but they exploded across the silent street. The speaker was a gray-haired man in a leather jacket, his shoulder tilted from a bullet wound. He gave no introduction, made no move to push forward. He simply stood, eyes fixed on JT, as though reuniting with a fragment of memory. Some turned to stare. Others watched as a ripple moved through the onlookers. An elderly woman whispered, "Is that true?" The gray-haired man stepped forward and drew from his inner pocket a small leather case, a faded military ID. Thacker Jerome, SEAL Team 4, OP, Dust Storm. And then everything changed. Someone in the crowd quickly looked up references on their phone. Within seconds, a grainy archival photo appeared, a night shot of 9 soldiers standing in desert sand, arms draped over each other's shoulders. One figure was gaunt, wearing a beanie emblazoned with a Navy emblem, the only one not smiling, but whose eyes glowed like a watchlight in the dark. It was JT. "That was in Paktika," the teammate continued, his tone as steady as recounting a film etched on his mind. "They'd booby-trapped the only exit, and the helicopter couldn't turn back. He left no one behind. One by one he carried us out. We lost 2 men, but the rest of us lived because of him." At that moment, the young officer's hand fell away from JT's shoulder, not because of orders, but because truth had peeled away every layer of prejudice from his eyes. No fanfare, no apology spoken. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. JT remained still as ever. He said nothing. He didn't look at Mendenhall. Perhaps he knew words were unnecessary now. A little boy slipped his hand from his father's coat pocket and quietly approached, holding a tiny American flag he'd brought from class the week before. Without a word, he held it out. JT studied him for a moment, then accepted the flag. His aged, calloused hand closed gently around it, not as a symbol, but as a memory returned. Someone began to clap. Not loudly, not in rhythm, but genuine applause, not for celebration, but for recognition. Then another joined in, and suddenly that frosty morning air felt warm, not by the sun, but by a truth brought into the light. And Mendenhall, he stood silently, lowering his hand, staring at the man before him, no longer seeing a potential risk, but a presence that made him reevaluate every definition he'd held of a suspicious person. My dear audience, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you in awe. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see people joining us from all around the world. News doesn't need sirens to travel far. It only needs a phone, or in this case, 7 phones, from 7 different angles, all capturing the moment a veteran was shoved against a wall for reading a newspaper. Less than 6 hours later, the video spread like a midsummer wildfire. From Twitter to Reddit, from the Fort Collins residents' Facebook group to a journalism student's TikTok account, the image of JT standing still, shoulders braced under the young officer's grip, his eyes holding that indefinable stare, was everywhere. People shared it not out of shock, but out of shame. The Fort Collins Police Department was forced to issue a statement. Joshua Mendenhall has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation for using unnecessary force on a non-threatening citizen. In bureaucratese, that means we were wrong, but we're still saving face. But the community didn't wait for the official report. They took action themselves. Local veterans immediately confirmed J.T. Thacker is living history that they had forgotten. Within 12 hours, a wave of posts shared old photos, training manuals, service certificates, and first-hand accounts only those who had lived in the trenches could truly understand. A retired Marine doctor from El Paso recounted the dust storm mission in Paktika province, where the SEAL team was pinned in a ring of fire, and only one man escaped to call in support before returning to carry each teammate to safety. That man was Thacker. Reporters from the Denver Post uncovered the 2004 mission dossier. The report read, Thacker led the team out of an illegally mined zone under sustained artillery fire, bringing every member out safely. No heroic flourish was needed. The action spoke for itself. The neighborhood where the incident occurred felt a shift in the air for days. A handwritten note appeared taped to the bakery door. Mr. Thacker, we apologize for letting you sit here alone all this time. No signature, none required. A young couple pinned a grainy newspaper clipping to the community bulletin board, scrawled beneath it, Do you know who the hero sitting in front of our bakery is? And then something no one expected. The Fort Collins School District organized a special lesson about community veterans. They began with one line, His name is Jerome Thacker. And here's what we overlooked. Local television crews arrived to interview him. He declined. A neighbor said, I asked if he'd seen the news. He told me I only watch the weather, so I know if I need a coat tomorrow morning. No further words needed. The past had spoken, and the community, in that rare moment, united around one truth. Not everyone in uniform is a hero, and not everyone who takes it off loses their worth. Because when we forget the man who kicked down the door to save lives, we lose more than a person. We lose one of our country's finest memories. Can that memory heal the silent wounds left behind? And what symbol will stand as the final testament to true recognition? Stay tuned for the concluding chapter. That afternoon, snow fell lightly, as though the sky itself wanted to make amends. Everything grew quiet, not from cold, but because something within people had softened. The bench in front of the bakery, the seat once deemed unfit for urban culture, was occupied again. JT returned, as if he'd never left, still in his worn coat, scuffed boots, and the faded navy beanie dusted with fresh snow. But today, something was different. Not in him, but in the way people looked at him. An elderly couple approached, hands holding steaming mugs of cocoa. They said nothing, asked nothing. They simply offered the drinks, then gently sat on the bench beside him, as though sharing the air was a way to say thanks. A 10-year-old boy hovered behind them, eyes equal parts curious and shy. Leaning toward his father, he whispered what should have been a secret, but the wind carried every word. "Is he really a SEAL?" The father did not answer at once. He studied JT, noted the shoulders no longer as broad as in youth, yet still carrying a posture few could match. Then he nodded softly, gazing, never leaving the man before him. And the only one who stood firm today, even after being pushed. No banners, no chorus. Yet on that small Fort Collins street, the image of a veteran seated in white snow, cradling a mug of cocoa, became the symbol of truth restored. A distant television crew parked far away, making no move to interview him. They simply aimed their camera from a respectful distance, perhaps understanding that some people should only be recorded, not disrupted. The bakery owner quietly placed a small sign behind the glass door. "Reserved for JT." No discussion followed, but everyone left that bench empty, unless he was sitting there, and something remarkable happened afterward. Over the next week, dozens of letters arrived at the paper recounting times they'd seen JT help without fanfare. Once he'd guided an elderly lady across a flickering crosswalk. Another time he'd pushed a cart for a single mother carrying a crying baby. No one knew his name then, but now they remembered. Because memory, when awakened rightly, can become a beacon illuminating all we once forgot. Late afternoon, the snow ceased. The sun cast a golden-orange glow over the damp pavement. On his faded beanie, the word Navy stood out as clear as ever, not because the snow had melted, but because the world's gaze had changed. A hero doesn't need a podium. He needs no accolades. He simply sits where he was once pushed and is embraced as part of the community he silently protected, and that is enough. Sometimes the greatest among us sit quietly beside us, needing no spotlight, no title, only a bench, a newspaper, and unwavering steadfastness. The story of J.T. Thacker is not just about a misunderstood veteran. It holds up a mirror to how easily our society forgets what truly matters. Quiet sacrifice, steadfast loyalty, and unassuming dignity. If today you've ever passed someone like him without pausing to see, remember, gratitude needs no holiday, only a heart that still feels. Share this story if you believe that people like JT deserve to be remembered. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Have you ever met a JT in your life? Like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the stories that touch the best parts of all of us. Thank you for listening. And please remember, sometimes heroes wear knit caps, not crowns.